Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Step into the Pivot. We're so happy to have you here. These are some of my favorite episodes when Evie and I just get to talk about different things. And since we are already halfway through this year, which is a crazy thing to me that we are already in July of 2026, it's just crazy. But anyway, so we're going to talk today about money. And it's an interesting topic for us to talk about money. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, this podcast is called Step into the Pivot. Why are you guys talking about money? But I think money is often an important piece of life and we don't embrace it. And you may need to pivot to get yourself involved with the money conversation. Why don't we, particularly as women, talk about money?
It's such a loaded topic, right? It is. Stuff comes up for us as soon as we say the word, and in any language. If I say the word money in Croatian, I say novac or lova. Immediately, that's like a jargon word for money, like cash or immediately something's going to start to reverberate. I can feel it in my gut that there's something that, I have a relationship with that word. I have a relationship with that concept. And I think that even those of us who are talking about money, maybe that's our profession, we're still avoiding the deeper layers of the conversation. So your question is excellent. We do avoid talking about money from the what does this mean perspective, the deeper perspective. And that's, like you say, particularly the case with women, I see and notice, because it's not a technical conversation only. It's a cultural conversation. It's a social conversation. It's an emotional conversation. It's a relational conversation. So it's going to be a complex conversation. When you start to unpack the conversation about money, you're going to find yourself in this terrain. You're going to be thinking and talking family. You're going to be thinking and talking fulfillment. You're going to be thinking and talking about, what does that career look like? Sometimes you and I joke about how a lot of the themes that we see coming through our episodes that we record with our guests have to do with a lot of C's. We've seen conversation and lessons about courage and constancy and clarity. And I wrote some of them down here, and confidence, and then cash. Here it is,
Oh,
right?
gosh.
So these big things are going to get activated when we start to we talk about cash. Next thing you know, we're talking about courage and confidence and clarity. And I said that conversation about money is not just technical, it's going to be structural. And what do I mean by that? Like on the structural side, women are still dealing with earnings gap. And we're dealing with caregiving interruptions. So what that means is that for a woman in the workforce, the fact that there'll be perhaps a time in her life when she is focused on children, there'll be an impact. There'll be a financial impact on what her earnings will look like, what her savings will look like. So lower lifetime savings. That's another structural thing that we experience. And there's excellent research on that. And we can maybe put some of that in the show notes. On the relational side, we're still, whether we like it or not, seeing from research that couples fall into traditional divisions of labor without consciously choosing them. You
Yep.
and I have talked about that. Like we
Yeah.
live with two very, conscious men, and we
Right.
sometimes, find ourselves in these like traditional roles. And so what that means from a money conversation is that women are conditioned, trained, taught to defer financial conversation, to defer a financial decision to their spouse
Yep.
because they believe that they lack the knowledge, that somehow they think that we're not capable. That's also conditioning. We're taught to
Yep.
think that we don't, but that's not true, right? It's not that we're incapable. It's that we have not been taught and encouraged from
Yeah.
early on
And
to
you
have
talked
that
about,
conversation.
yeah, and you talked about some of those C words, right? And I'll add a couple more:
Yeah.
career, right? Career is another C word that comes into play when we're talking about this. I'll even talk about couples because I think it's one of the things that couples don't do enough about is talk about money and where they're at and make sure they're on their same page. And that's really important. And that's going to change too as you move through your couple journey. It's going to be different when you're newlyweds versus when you're raising your family versus when you're, ready to retire and nearing retirement, that those conversations change a little bit and are really meant to grow. I want to also say something else to our listeners is we are not financial advisors. We are not giving you financial advice. Really, this is about having a conversation and how that fits into your life. I feel strongly about this topic because I have heard conversations with women who have been left and they get divorced or something else happens and they really have no idea what was going on with the money situation. They really had no control. They really, I knew one who sold her very successful practice and gave her husband the money thinking he was investing it, and he lost it all, and then he divorced her. And that's an extreme example, so I don't want to scare everybody. That is not the purpose. It's just knowing and understanding your money situation is an important piece of not only your own life, but your life as a couple. Like, no matter where you're at, knowing and understanding that is really important to me.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a related example. Actually, I just talked to somebody yesterday about that, where I asked them if they have a financial advisor, and they shared that they didn't. And when I asked how come, they said that and this is a female, that they let the financial advisor go when they divorced their
That
husband
happens a lot.
because,
When a husband
yeah,
dies, the women
yeah.
don't have that relationship with that financial advisor and they will move it. So, yeah,
Exactly. And the point there is that there is research that also shows that these kinds of changes in terms of advisor-client relationship it happens really extremely frequently. We can put some of that in the show notes also. During a transition, that's when you're really yeah, if you are in the advisor position, chances are there will be a change. If you've not developed a strong relationship with your client, when there is a life change, that relationship might walk away. And oftentimes it will be the woman who says, "Hey, you know what? You haven't been asking me for an opinion all these
yeah.
years."
One of my favorite statistics that Charles Schwab came out with recently that I
Hmm.
saw. Did you know that by 2030, $30 trillion will be controlled by women? But by
Wow.
2045, only 15 years later, it will be 84 trillion, almost three times as much. And that tells you where this is going for women, and also tells you that
Mm,
women need to get involved in this. I think your comment too about the financial advisor is totally true, in that women are afraid of looking stupid, or they don't ask the question because they don't think the
yeah.
advisor is really listening to them or cares what their opinion is. So it's an
Hmm.
it's going to be an interesting shift. It's going to be an interesting pivot over the next,
Yes.
uh, many years. I mean, 2045 sounds like a long time away, but it's less than 20 years
Yes.
from now.
Yes. And since our background is in retirement services, you've heard me say this before. I am noticing that the entire industry is going to have to is pivoting, whether, again, we're recognizing that or not, from the focus on the three F's in the conversation around fees, funds, and fiduciary, to including the fourth F more consciously. We've always been talking about the fourth F, feelings. But now we're going to have to talk about feelings very specifically, particularly as you look at this situation like you were describing with the change in wealth as part of the great wealth transfer, because now that women are gaining economic power so quickly, that control of wealth and the confidence with wealth, that does not always go hand in hand. And so I have some questions for you about, like, specifically how
Sure.
women can start raising confidence when it comes to money. But I just want to highlight back to this pivot from, towards more participation and confidence. This is where education and conversation about feelings and
Yep.
fees
Yep.
and funds and
Yep.
fiduciary concepts and all things finance and support become really important.
Yep. For sure.
I
Okay,
know
let's
you've,
dive into your questions. Let's
yeah, I
let's
know
dive
you've,
into this.
yeah. So speaking of that, you have been educating women, you have been educating and supporting people about some of the, some of the pretty, um, I mean, it seems like, fundamental. I think that's a good word, like fundamental concepts. But what's been really interesting to me is I've seen you and heard you have that conversation also with people who are educated. When it comes to your own money, sometimes it's really hard to take your own medicine, right? So some of us, practice being great stewards of other people's finances, but then when it comes to our own, somebody else reminding us of the fundamentals can still be really useful. So I know that people do come to you during financial pivots because you have a lot of experience, and also as someone who is a business owner who successfully maneuvered, all kinds of transitions. So, first of all, I'm really curious, what's one of the most common worries that women come and talk to you about when it comes to money?
Yeah. I think a few. And I think these are going to tie into some of our other things. One is that they are not saving any money. And that plays into so many things, right? That they feel that they don't have any money saved, whether that's, for emergencies, whether that's for, enough saved for retirement. And there's many reasons why those things happen. But I think it's also, I'm gonna dive down a little deeper. I think some of that comes from they don't know where their money is going every day, right?
Mm,
It's that they don't have a budget. They don't understand, they think, their $7 Starbucks every day is not affecting them. But when you multiply that by 365 days a year, it's a pretty big number, right? There's some of those things that they're not saving because they don't really understand what's happening with their money today. And that's really hard to do, don't get me wrong, but I would encourage you, if you feel that's true, for the next month, just track every single dollar you're spent. There's lots of apps out there that can help you. You can do it in a spreadsheet, you can go back and review it, however that looks for you. But I think really understanding where your money's going is
mhm.
really key.
Hmm. Yes, this is really great. And I'm thinking about the word awareness, and also one of the pivots here really being from avoidance to awareness. Because I have my mug here that says coffee for all. And as soon as you started talking about like cutting coffee from my budget, I got,
Well, and
but
I'm not talking about cutting it from your
no,
budget. I'm
not at
talking about
all.
not spending $7 at Starbucks
Yes.
and instead making it at home for
So
50
I have a good
cents.
example totally that I think really goes with that. So for me, when I travel and I work, it is so supportive and resourcing when I do pick up my Americano that I really, and this is not sponsored by Starbucks, but like me, when I'm traveling and working, that Americano is really something that is so additive to my day. Like it really makes a big difference. However, I'm actually in the process of tracking my expenses really closely right now. If I look at how little I get in terms of enjoyment and usefulness from the cappuccino that I add to a lunch, just because it kind of like sounds nice in the afternoon when I've already had my coffee that I really wanted and needed and loved, like that is where, oh my God, that's absolutely not necessary. And if I'm becoming more aware of my spending and what I'm doing, now I'm finding these cappuccinos that have kind of like snuck in there, and sometimes I add them for these relational reasons, social reasons. We won't unpack them right now, but I'm unconscious about it. So I want to be aware that that is something I can definitely impact. How do we make the conversation around saving? And maybe that looks like expense cutting, budgeting, empowering. How do we make it feel empowering rather than
Right.
restrictive. I think you gave us an example, but maybe
Right.
just a little bit more about that pivot from
Yeah.
like, this is not a punishment. It's not a,
It's not a punishment. It's about having that control. And even I would even say once you get that emergency savings set up, and they recommend somewhere between 3 and 6 months of emergency savings. I would err on the 6 month side to make sure you have enough. But then you can take even that money and use it more towards vacations and other types of things.
and of course, depending on your circumstances, this is going to be a different conversation because I know some folks may be listening and thinking, this what we're talking about doesn't apply to someone who is really, where every single dollar is earmarked and they know exactly where the money is going and there still isn't enough. So I just want to be really clear that we care so deeply about
For sure.
every possible scenario that we could
For
be,
sure.
unpacking here. And that at the end of the day, the question of like, what's enough and what's abundance and what's scarcity and what's freedom and what does it mean to feel relaxed about money? That is, it will so deeply depend on your circumstances, on your situation, but that the answers are similar in terms of awareness, um, support, being open to saying, I don't understand this. Yesterday,
Yep.
somebody called me and said, I got this statement. I can't tell. Is this identity theft or is this a real bill or is the so them just reaching out and saying, can you help? What do you think? Opening up the conversation in general is what I'm, really passionate about, regardless of where you are you know, on the money
Yeah.
scale, the money
Well,
continuum.
and I'm going to use the word control, even though I don't
Hmm.
totally love the word control. But when you understand that and are in control of your money, whether it's this end or that end of the
Yeah.
spectrum, whatever it is, it's going to bring you that peace and that happiness, right? Like just knowing it and understanding it. And I think you're right about we're afraid to ask, we're afraid to do that. Let's talk for a minute about couples and having this conversation as a couple, especially when you haven't been involved. Maybe you've let your spouse kind of handle that, or your significant other, whatever that looks like, right? And we can even bring kids into this conversation. How are they going to learn if we don't talk to them? So, how do we pivot that, Evie, to talk about? And I have my ideas, but I'd love to hear yours because it's not always an easy conversation to do that. But how do we make that shift to
Hmm.
have this important conversation as a couple, as a family?
Hmm. I think that in my personal and and professional experience, it is very important to start with yourself. So having your own clarity about what matters to you, what your values are. I recently heard someone say, like, just show me your expenses and I'll tell you what your values are. Show me what you're spending on and show me your calendar and I'll tell you what your values are. So doing that first, internal and personal self-examination and self-assessment of where do I stand on this question, on this topic, and why is this really important to me? And can I articulate it? And for women in particular, being willing to have the conversation. Many women are excellent daily money managers, but then they don't really translate that into thinking that that really makes them a very important constituent with a loud message in the conversation with financial advisor. And which
Yep.
brings me to my next point. So the first one is like get really clear on what's important to you before you start, back and forthing with your loved one or the whole, family ecosystem. Do you know what matters to you? And second, I do think that having professional support is key. And that
Yep.
professional support does exist for, all kinds of circumstances and situations. There are also a lot of folks in our industry who donate their services depending on,
Yep.
where you fall. There's some excellent guidance online available nowadays
Yep.
too. But
Yep.
I don't want to call it like mediation. I think that, I'm thinking again back on to my personal example, having a person who would sit down with us as we were as a family making some big decisions and just like facilitate that conversation
Yep.
it went so much better. So getting really clear on what's important to you, asking for some professional help, and otherwise really listening back to the beginning of the conversation, the deeper discussion. What are we really talking about? Are you getting upset when I say that we should cut this expense? Because there's something here that's really touching, touching your heart, maybe
Yep.
speaking to your, sense of joy or sense of, freedom, relaxation. It's not maybe about that cappuccino, maybe it
Yep.
is, maybe it's
Yep.
about something deeper. So being better at hearing each other out and
Yeah, I
listening
love
for
that.
the deeper
I love
meaning.
that. It's just like anything else in
Yeah.
your life as a couple or as a family. You have to talk about it, right? It
Yeah.
can't just go hidden because that creates unknown. I want to just bring up one other thing before we end this episode. We are in financial services and have been for years. And, the American Retirement Association has its first Women's Retirement Security Day. And so when we talk about saving, right, I talked about emergency savings, I talked about a savings for other things, but we should also think about our retirement. And it's really about raising that awareness. And retirement may seem a long way away, but it's going to be here before we know it. And you're going to be very happy to have those savings when you are done with your career and really want to retire with dignity. So we'll put some information about that out in the show notes as well if you want to do a little more digging and get a little more information on that. But retirement is something that is near and dear to our hearts. And is a very important piece. And maybe it's not the number one piece. Maybe that's the emergency savings. Maybe it's getting some other things, but it is an important piece because you will be happy you did it later. So I know we're out of time. Any last thoughts before we wrap today? And I think we could have this conversation again. I'd love to hear from some of our listeners to see if there's a specific thing they'd love for us to talk about. That's important to us.
We end our episodes with saying, asking each other, how is this pivot a step forward? So, how is it going to be a step forward for women in particular to become more aware of what's going on with their money? Money in some of the other circumstances, some of the other settings, I've said money is energy. So, be a really good steward of what is the space and place where you're spending your energy. And that way you can really start to lean more into a sense of agency and empowerment. So this is a pivot from
Yep.
avoidance to awareness to agency. And as Teresa always says, to wrap up our sessions here, our conversations, when you have a pivot, step
Step
into
into it.
it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're entirely right. This is something for you as an individual to think about and how that pivot, how you need to make that pivot.
Yeah.
So thank you, Evie. Love our conversations always. Thank you to all our listeners. We are happy to have you. Happy 4th of July since we're here and halfway through this year. So we will see you on the next episode.
Thank you.